No one in Michigan said it out loud in the 1970s, but many felt the same strange thing every morning. The days felt longer than they should have been. Not because time moved slower on the clock, but because everything inside those hours felt heavier, thicker, almost resistant, and no one could quite explain why. So what was stretching time itself in this place? Morning in Michigan didn't begin with sunlight. It began with sound. The low mechanical groan of factory sirens rolled across neighborhoods before dawn, seeping through thin walls and closed windows. In towns built around auto plants, the siren wasn't just a signal. It was authority. When it wailed, bodies moved almost automatically. Men rose from beds without speaking. Coffee was poured in silence. Boots hit linoleum floors already cold from the night. Outside, the air carried a familiar mix of oil, damp asphalt, and iron. The smell clung to jackets, hair, skin. Even before a shift began, the factory had already arrived. But how did an ordinary morning come to feel so final, so unavoidable? Houses looked identical from the street. Small, square, practical. Lawns were trimmed short. Cars rested nose to nose in driveways, engines ticking softly as they warmed. Curtains twitched. Neighbors nodded but rarely waved. Everyone was awake. No one lingered. Inside the homes, time stretched in quieter ways. Kitchen clocks ticked loudly. Toast burned while no one watched it. Radios murmured the same voices every morning. Weather, traffic, news from places far away. Vietnam, Washington, the economy. Words floated through the room but landed nowhere specific. Children ate cereal without appetite. Mothers packed lunches with practiced precision. Fathers checked their watches even when they already knew the time. There was always the sense that being late was more dangerous than being tired. But what exactly were they afraid of losing? By mid-morning, Michigan was fully in motion. Factories swallowed workers by the thousands. Conveyor belts began their endless crawl. Metal struck metal. Presses slammed down with violence disguised as routine. The noise was constant, so constant that it stopped sounding loud and started sounding permanent. Inside there were no windows. Time was measured by breaks, not hours. 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there. Cigarettes burned down quickly. Coffee tasted metallic. Outside, the sky changed color unnoticed. For those not inside the plants, time dragged differently. Grocery aisles stretched longer than expected. School days felt padded with silence. Streets were calm, almost too calm, as if holding their breath. Was this stability, or was it waiting for something to break? Afternoons arrived slowly. School buses hissed to a stop. Children spilled out, loud at first, then quieter as they reached their homes. Televisions flickered on, filling rooms with reruns and laughter that didn't quite match the mood of the day. Mothers began dinner preparations hours before anyone was hungry. The clatter of pots echoed in kitchens that felt too still. Windows stayed closed even when the weather was mild. The air outside carried residue from the plants. Some afternoons, the sunlight turned orange before it should have. No one commented on it. Why did the light itself seem tired? When the factory shifts ended, men returned home coated in exhaustion. That soap never fully removed. The smell followed them inside. It settled into couches, into walls, into the fabric of daily life. Dinner. Conversations were brief, practical. Weather, bills, tomorrow's shift. No one asked big questions. The television spoke more than anyone else. And yet, beneath the routine, something subtle pulsed. An unspoken awareness that this rhythm, this way of living, could not stretch forever, even if the days felt endless. But if everyone sensed it, why did no one say it out loud? As night fell, Michigan quieted again. Streetlights hummed. Snow or rain, depending on the season, softened the edges of everything. Clocks kept ticking. Tomorrow waited patiently. People went to sleep believing they had survived another ordinary day. They didn't yet realize that these Long days were quietly shaping something else entirely, a collective memory heavy with nostalgia, loss, and questions that would only surface years later. And when those questions finally emerged, they would begin with one simple thought. Why did it all feel so normal at the time? Because what came next would reveal that normal had been doing far more damage than anyone imagined. By the early 1970s, routine in Michigan was no longer just a habit. It had become a form of anesthesia. Days repeated themselves with such precision that weeks blurred together. Monday felt like Thursday. Seasons changed quietly. Snow came, melted, returned again. Calendars were flipped, but nothing truly shifted. For many, this predictability felt safe, almost comforting. Yet beneath that comfort, something was slowly dulling. When did repetition stop protecting people and start numbing them instead? Time inside Michigan's communities didn't pass, it settled. Morning routines were inherited rather than chosen. A boy watched his father tie the same boots, at the same chair, every day. A girl memorized her mother's movements in the kitchen before she understood why those movements existed at all. Life was learned by observation, not conversation. The radio played familiar songs, familiar voices, familiar promises. Change always sounded like it was happening somewhere else. And slowly, without announcement, curiosity began to disappear. What happens to a place when questions stop being asked? In schools, clocks hung above chalkboards like quiet judges. Lessons followed strict outlines, just like factory shifts. Creativity had boundaries. Ambition had limits that were rarely spoken, but widely understood. Guidance counselors suggested realistic paths. Parents nodded. Students listened. College was mentioned, but work was expected. The plants were always there, always hiring, always waiting. It wasn't fear that kept people in line, it was certainty. But what kind of certainty refuses to imagine alternatives? Afternoons grew heavier as the decade moved on. Living rooms became holding spaces, places to sit between obligations. The television offered escape without effort. Sitcom laughter filled the air, but no one laughed as hard as the audience track insisted they should. Commercials promised better cars, better lives, brighter futures. The message was clear. Happiness was close, but never quite here. People learned to wait, but wait for what exactly? The sensory world reflected the same dull consistency. The hum of appliances never stopped. Refrigerators buzzed. Furnaces kicked on and off. Outside, traffic moved steadily, predictably. The same routes, the same turns, the same destinations. Even nature felt restrained. Rivers ran past industrial banks. Trees stood in orderly lines along streets. Snow was plowed quickly, efficiently, erased as soon as it appeared. Nothing was allowed to linger too long. Was this control or was it avoidance? Conversations followed patterns too. At dinner tables, silence was not uncomfortable. It was expected. Feelings were rarely named. Problems were handled privately, if at all. Complaints were small, manageable, never structural. People spoke about weather instead of worry, about schedules instead of stress, about tomorrow instead of decades. At first, no one called it a crisis. In Michigan, the early signs of trouble never arrived as explosions. They arrived as delays, a shift that ended 10 minutes early, a notice pinned slightly crooked on a bulletin board, a supervisor using words like temporary and adjustment. Most people barely reacted. Routine absorbed the change and moved on. But when did temporary begin to feel permanent? The factories were still running, but something in their rhythm had changed. Machines paused more often, conveyor belts slowed, then restarted without explanation. Overtime became inconsistent, available one week, gone the next. Paychecks arrived, but their certainty felt thinner. Men noticed it first in their bodies. They came home more tired than usual, yet strangely restless. Sleep didn't settle them the way it once had. Some stared longer at the television. Others sat in silence, listening to the house breathe. No one complained openly. If the work was still there, why did it feel like it was already slipping away? In grocery stores, prices crept upward quietly. Not enough to shock, just enough to be noticed. A few cents more for bread. Meat purchased less often. Brands replaced with cheaper alternatives that tasted almost the same. Shoppers paused longer in aisles, comparing labels, doing mental math. Carts were filled carefully, strategically. Cashiers saw it all day long. No one mentioned it. When did caution become a daily skill? At schools, the mood shifted subtly. Teachers spoke more often about practical skills. Art programs lost funding. Field trips were shortened or cancelled. Guidance offices emphasized local opportunities. Nearby, stable, familiar. Students felt it even if they couldn't name it. Dreams began shrinking before they fully formed. Some stopped planning altogether. What happens when a generation learns to lower its expectations before life even tests them? Afternoons no longer felt neutral. The quiet carried tension now, a low, persistent awareness that something was off. Radio stayed on longer, as if silence might confirm a fear no one wanted to face. News reports about oil prices, strikes, and foreign conflicts felt suddenly relevant. The outside world was no longer out there. It was knocking gently at Michigan's door. But why did the knock feel so familiar, so unsurprising? The sensory details changed too. The air smelled sharper some days, heavier others. Snow fell dirtier than before, streaked with grey. Sunlight reflected off factory windows with a glare that felt harsh, almost accusing. Even sounds felt amplified. A slammed car door, a raised voice, a siren at the wrong hour. Small things lingered longer in the mind. Was the environment changing, or were people simply paying attention for the first time? At dinner tables, conversations hesitated. Sentences trailed off. Topics shifted abruptly. Children learned when not to ask questions. Adults learned how to answer without saying much. Words like layoff hovered nearby but remained unspoken. Hope was discussed carefully, as if it were fragile. People still believed in work. They still believed in effort. They were just beginning to doubt the system that promised those things would be enough. And if effort no longer guaranteed stability, what did? By the late afternoon, Michigan's streets filled again, but with a different energy. People walked faster, drove more aggressively. Patience shortened. Politeness felt strained, almost performative. Routine was still there, but it no longer soothed. It distracted, and distraction, once noticed, stopped working. How long can a community look away before it has to confront what's in front of it? Night brought reflection instead of rest. Some stayed awake longer than usual, staring at ceilings, replaying conversations that hadn't actually happened. Others drank more than before, or worked on projects that went nowhere. Anything to feel productive. Tomorrow still waited, but now it felt uncertain. The days were still long, but they no longer felt endless. They felt numbered, because the cracks once visible would begin to spread into homes, into identities, and into the very idea of what Michigan was supposed to be. By the mid-1970s, the changes in Michigan were no longer just economic. They were personal. Work had never been only a paycheck here. It was identity. It was proof. It was how people explained themselves without saying much at all. What do you do? Had always been an easy question. Now it wasn't. If work defined you, what happened when that definition started to weaken? Men who had spent years measuring life in shifts and output found themselves measuring something harder to quantify: relevance. Some still had their jobs, but not their confidence. They noticed younger workers watching them differently. They felt replaceable in ways they hadn't before. Skills that once guaranteed respect now felt outdated, even fragile. At home, this uncertainty had nowhere obvious to go. Silence became the most common response. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it felt dangerous. How do you explain fear in a place that values endurance over honesty? Families absorbed the tension unevenly. Mothers noticed it in small behaviors. A door closed more often, a temper that flared without warning, a distant look at the dinner table. They adjusted quietly, stretching meals, delaying purchases, smoothing over emotional rough edges. Children learned new rules without being taught. Ask less, need less, expect less. Love was still present, but it moved more cautiously now. What does care look like when everyone is quietly protecting everyone else? Afternoons stretched again, but differently than before. Time no longer felt heavy. It felt hollow. The hours after school or work passed in a strange stillness, as if life were waiting for instructions that never arrived. Television stayed on longer, not for entertainment, but for company. The glow filled rooms that felt larger and emptier than they used to. Even laughter sounded different, shorter, uncertain, as if checking whether it was appropriate. When did comfort become something people felt they had to earn? Community spaces changed in subtle ways. Church attendance dipped, then stabilized at lower numbers. Local events felt smaller, less animated. The same faces showed up, but with less energy, fewer conversations. Trust remained, but it was quieter now, less automatic. People noticed who was still around and who wasn't, who moved away, who stopped showing up. Absence became a language of its own. What does it mean when the gaps become more noticeable than the people themselves? The sensory world reflected the emotional one. Rooms felt colder even when heated. Chairs felt harder. Light felt flatter. The smell of oil and metal still lingered, but now it mixed with something else. Stale coffee, old paper, waiting. Even the sounds of Michigan shifted. The steady roar of industry softened in places. In its absence, smaller noises stood out, ticking clocks, distant trains, wind against siding. Silence had texture now. What happens when the background noise disappears and all that remains is thought? Identity, once inherited, now required maintenance. People worked harder to appear unchanged. Same routines, same expressions, same answers to familiar questions. But underneath, doubt threaded through everything. Were they still providing enough? Still progressing? Still becoming what they were supposed to become? The questions weren't asked aloud, but they shaped every decision. And if no one spoke them, did that make them less real? Nightfall brought a new kind of exhaustion. Not physical, existential. People slept but woke unsatisfied. Dreams replayed past conversations, past versions of themselves. The future appeared rarely, and when it did, it felt vague. Michigan still looked the same in the dark, but it no longer felt the same to live in. Because once identity begins to erode, something else must replace it. And Michigan was about to discover what that would be. By the late 1970s, Michigan was no longer unraveling quietly. It was holding itself together by habit alone. People still followed routines, but now those routines felt performative, acted out for the sake of stability, rather than belief. The shared understanding that had once bound communities together began to thin. Not break, just stretch. How much strain can a community absorb before something gives? Public spaces carried a different energy now. At gas stations, conversations were shorter, sharper. Small disagreements lingered longer than they should have. In line at the post office or grocery store, people stood closer than necessary, aware of one another in ways that felt unfamiliar. It wasn't hostility, it was pressure, a sense that everyone was carrying something heavy and hoping not to drop it in public. What happens when politeness becomes the last barrier between order and conflict? News reports played a larger role in daily life. Strikes in other states, layoffs in neighboring towns, political debates that felt increasingly personal. The television no longer just filled space, it shaped mood. Voices grew louder, opinions hardened. Silence after the broadcast felt heavier than the program itself. People began to disagree more openly, but without resolution. If arguments never lead to change, what purpose do they serve? Workplaces reflected the shift. Break rooms grew quieter, then more divided. Conversations that once included everyone now happened in clusters. Rumors moved faster than facts. Trust became conditional. Management spoke in reassurances. Workers listened carefully, searching for meaning between the lines. Every announcement was analyzed. Every pause felt intentional. When words lose their reliability, what replaces them? Despite the tension, moments of solidarity still appeared. Neighbors shoveled one another's driveways without being asked. Someone always had jumper cables. Food appeared on doorsteps after bad news. No explanation attached. These gestures mattered, but they also revealed how fragile things had become. Support was no longer assumed. It had to be demonstrated. Care became quieter, more deliberate. Why did kindness feel more necessary and more urgent than before? The sensory environment sharpened. Sounds felt louder. Laughter, when it happened, startled people. The smell of exhaust, of cold metal, of wet concrete seemed more present, harder to ignore. Weather changes hit harder. Winters felt longer. Summers more oppressive. Even the sky seemed to press down on the state, low and gray. Michigan felt enclosed. Was the environment closing in? Or were people simply losing their sense of openness? Families carried the tension home. Arguments started over small things. Noise, money, timing. They ended unresolved, lingering in the air long after words stopped. Children absorbed more than adults realized. Some withdrew. Some acted out. Some learned to read a room instantly, adjusting themselves to maintain calm. Resilience became a survival skill learned early. What does it do to a generation to grow up managing adult stress? By night, the state felt restless. People stayed up later, watched more television, drove aimlessly through familiar streets. The urge to move, to do something, clashed with the absence of clear direction. Michigan was not collapsing, but it was no longer steady. The tension, once invisible, was now shared, felt in conversations, in posture, in the way people listened. And once tension becomes communal, it demands an outcome. Because the next phase would force Michigan to choose. Hold together or begin pulling apart. Michigan did not face a single moment of collapse. There was no clear line between before and after. Instead, there were decisions, small, private, almost invisible ones, made quietly, day after day. And together, those decisions began to change everything. When history looks back, how often does it miss the moments that mattered most? Some choices happened early in the morning. A man lingered in bed a few minutes longer, staring at the ceiling before getting up. Not out of laziness, but calculation. Was today worth the same effort as yesterday? Would it be noticed if he slowed down? If he saved his strength? He still went to work, but something had shifted. Effort became measured, energy conserved. What happens when people stop giving more than is required? Other decisions happened at kitchen tables. A family postponed replacing an old appliance. A vacation was quietly cancelled. College savings were revisited. A word that softened the reality of reduction. No announcement, no argument, just an adjustment that became permanent without being named. How many futures are altered without ever being openly rejected? In neighborhoods, loyalty began to reorganize. People still helped one another, but more selectively. Trust narrowed. Help flowed toward those who felt safe, familiar, reliable. Newcomers blended in more slowly. Outsiders remained outsiders longer. Community did not disappear. It contracted. When circles grow smaller, who gets left outside them? At work, decisions grew sharper. Some spoke up more, risking attention. Others became quieter, protecting themselves through invisibility. A few started looking elsewhere. Other towns, other states, other versions of life that felt increasingly abstract. Most stayed, not because they believed deeply, but because staying felt less frightening than leaving. Is endurance always a strength, or can it become a form of surrender? The sensory world recorded these choices. The sound of laughter was rarer but more intentional. When it happened, it lingered longer, as if people wanted to hold on to it. Music played louder in cars, windows rolled up, private escapes moving through public streets. The smell of home-cooked food became more frequent, not celebratory, but grounding, familiar, reliable. People sought control wherever they could find it. Why does comfort become so valuable when uncertainty grows? Children watched everything. They noticed when parents stopped talking about the future and started talking about getting through. They learned which questions created tension and which were safe. Some became careful. Some became defiant. Some became very good at adapting. They would carry these lessons far beyond Michigan. What parts of a childhood stay with you long after the place itself fades? As the decade neared its end, Michigan settled into a new posture. Not defeated, not hopeful, braced. People didn't expect things to improve quickly. They didn't expect them to fall apart either. They lived in between, adjusting expectations, tightening routines, conserving belief. The days were still long, but now they were shaped by choice rather than habit. And choice, once recognized, changes how time feels. Because the next chapter would ask a harder question: what happens when a generation realizes it has adapted to less and calls it normal? By the end of the 1970s, Michigan had adjusted, not upward, but inward. What once would have felt like loss now passed as expectation. Fewer opportunities, smaller dreams, narrower definitions of success. None of it arrived suddenly. It settled slowly, like dust, until it became part of the landscape. People didn't say they had lowered their hopes. They said they had become realistic. But when did realism quietly replace possibility? The generational divide widened without open conflict. Parents remembered momentum, expansion, a time when effort reliably led somewhere better. They carried those memories quietly, unsure how to pass them on without sounding naive or disappointed. Children, on the other hand, learned a different lesson. They grew up watching caution outperform ambition. They saw stability rewarded more than risk. They absorbed the idea that survival mattered more than growth. Not because anyone taught them, but because it worked. What happens when an entire generation is trained to expect less from the start? Schools reflected the shift clearly now. Achievement was praised, but modestly. Excellence was encouraged, but cautiously. The emphasis wasn't on reaching far, but on landing safely. Teachers cared deeply, but they too had adjusted. They prepared students for a world they believed would actually exist, not the one they wished for. Guidance officers spoke the language of limits fluently. You'll be fine. Stay close to home. Don't overreach. The message was subtle, consistent, and effective. If no one ever tells you to aim higher, do you even realize that you could? The sensory environment mirrored the emotional one. Clothes were worn longer, objects repaired instead of replaced. Houses changed less over time. Familiarity became a kind of pride. The sounds of Michigan grew steadier, quieter. Fewer celebrations, fewer disruptions. Life moved at a careful economical pace. Even joy became efficient. Laughter was brief but sincere. Happiness appeared in contained moments, shared meals, weekend rituals, predictable comforts. People learned to savor what fit within reach. Is contentment still contentment if it's shaped by constraint? Conversations about the future became abstract. Someday replaced dates, maybe replaced plans. People spoke about change as something cyclical, distant, something that would return on its own without being chased. Waiting became a strategy, and strategies once normalized stopped feeling temporary. How long can a society wait before waiting becomes its identity? Children sensed the contradiction. They were told they could be anything, but shown something else entirely. They learned to read between statements and outcomes. They noticed which paths were celebrated and which were quietly discouraged. Some accepted it fully. Some resisted internally. Some left as soon as they could. Most stayed longer than they expected. Michigan shaped them, not loudly, but thoroughly. What parts of a place stay with you even after you leave it behind? By the time the decade closed, the long days of Michigan had changed meaning. They were no longer heavy with routine or tension. They were contained. Life fit into smaller frames. People adjusted their posture to match the space available. Loss was no longer dramatic. It was ambient. And yet beneath the calm, something unresolved remained. A quiet awareness that this normalization had come at a cost. Because when loss becomes normal, the final question is no longer what was taken, but what was never allowed to grow. Years later, when people looked back on 1970s Michigan, they rarely spoke about crisis. They spoke about simplicity, about closeness, about a time when things made sense. Memory softened the edges, but memory also edited. What did time choose to preserve? And what did it quietly erase? Nostalgia arrived not as a feeling but as a narrative. Photographs showed smiling faces, tidy homes, familiar cars. Old songs brought warmth. Stories focused on togetherness, not tension. Stability, not strain. The long days were remembered as peaceful, the silence as calm. Very little was said about what it cost to keep things that way. Why does distance make endurance look like contentment? The sensory world of memory felt warmer than reality had been. Summers glowed brighter. Winters felt cozier. Factories appeared as symbols of pride rather than pressure. The smell of oil and metal became shorthand for purpose instead of exhaustion. People remembered the routine, but not the weight of it. They remembered community, but not the contraction. Time, it seemed, preferred stories that could be carried easily. What truths become inconvenient once they stop being immediate? Those who left Michigan carried a different version. They remembered the stillness as suffocating, the caution as limiting, the long days as a kind of waiting they hadn't understood until it ended. Distance sharpened what proximity had blurred. Leaving allowed comparison, and comparison revealed what staying had required. How clearly can you see a place only after it no longer holds you? For those who stayed, memory served another purpose. It offered continuity. By remembering the past as stable, people justified the present. The story of endurance became proof of strength. Adaptation became resilience. Compromise became wisdom. These interpretations weren't wrong, but they weren't complete. Can something be both survivable and quietly damaging at the same time? Objects became anchors of remembrance. Old lunch pails, factory badges, worn furniture. These items carried meaning beyond their use. They represented effort, reliability, a way of life that no longer needed explanation. People kept them not because they were useful, but because they confirmed a story about who they had been and who they believed they still were. What do we hold on to when the context that gave it meaning is gone? The long days, when remembered, lost their tension. They became symbols of a slower world, a time before urgency, before constant change. But what memory framed as slowness had often been hesitation. What it framed as peace had often been restraint. What it framed as normal had required countless small sacrifices that never made headlines. Does nostalgia honor the past, or protect us from confronting it honestly? Looking back, the people of Michigan rarely described regret. They described acceptance. They spoke of making do, of getting by, of finding value in what remained, and in many ways they were right. But beneath those reflections lingered a softer, harder to name emotion. Not anger, not sorrow, recognition. The realization that something meaningful had been lost so gradually that no one noticed it leaving. Because the final chapter would not ask what Michigan endured, but what it taught those who lived. Through its longest days, in the end, the story of 1970s Michigan was never about collapse. It was about adaptation, a slow, collective reshaping of expectations that happened so gradually it felt natural. People didn't wake up one morning changed. They adjusted in increments, small enough to survive, large enough to alter the future. And only years later did the full shape of that change become visible. What does a place leave behind when it never truly falls apart? Michigan taught its people how to endure without spectacle. There were no dramatic turning points most could point to, no single decision that explained everything. Instead, there were thousands of quiet compromises, each reasonable on its own, powerful in accumulation. Work continued, families stayed intact, communities functioned. From the outside, it looked like success, but inside, something essential had shifted, from expansion to maintenance, from ambition to preservation. Is survival still a victory when growth quietly disappears? The long days left marks that outlasted the decade. They shaped how people measured risk, how they defined enough, how they understood responsibility. Caution became wisdom. Stability became virtue. Wanting more became something to justify rather than celebrate. These lessons traveled forward in time. They appeared in how children raised their own families, in how they approached opportunity, in how they responded to uncertainty. Michigan's rhythm didn't end. It echoed. How many choices are we still making based on a world that no longer exists? The sensory memory lingered strongest. The hum of industry, even when gone, remained in the imagination. The smell of oil and cold air still triggered recognition decades later. A radio song could collapse time instantly, returning a listener to a kitchen, a driveway, a factory gate. These sensations carried belonging. They reminded people that they had been part of something structured, shared and demanding, and that belonging mattered, even when it asked for sacrifice. Why do the hardest places to live often become the hardest to let go of? Michigan did not lose its people's dignity. If anything, it reinforced it. The decade taught restraint, mutual reliance, and quiet strength. It proved that communities could absorb pressure without shattering, that care could exist without drama, that identity could persist even when its foundations weakened. These were real achievements, but they came with a cost that was rarely acknowledged. What do we fail to name when we praise resilience too quickly? Looking back, the long days of Michigan now read like a lesson rather than a warning. They show how normal can stretch beyond comfort, how patience can become postponement, how adaptation, left unchecked, can quietly narrow possibility. No villain caused it, no single force controlled it. It happened because it worked, until it didn't need to anymore. How often do societies mistake endurance for destiny? The people of Michigan carried on. They built lives, raised families, found meaning where they could. Many never felt cheated, only shaped. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of those years. Not loss, not failure, but a deep, inherited understanding that time can change a place without ever announcing itself. The days had been long, and in that length, an entire way of seeing the world had taken form, quietly, patiently, and permanently. Because the longest days are rarely remembered for how they ended, but for how they taught people to live.